Hello again, everybody. You have completed day 4 of our class on developing educational entrepreneurship. You must feel pretty good about that. I feel pretty good about that. And I have enjoyed reading and making comments on your assignments that you've been turning in every day. I think it's fascinating to see how your ideas are developing, and I really appreciate the honesty that it takes to work through some of those ideas, and quite frankly, some of the struggles that it takes to work through some of those ideas. So, good job. Keep up the good work. I know that it's difficult when you're in the thick of it, but it's coming together, and I think that you'll be able to see, perhaps after the course has ended or after you've put it all together for the final draft strategic plan, I think you'll really see how all these parts fit together. Hopefully you're seeing that as you go along, but you never know. At the end of day 4 here, I just wanted to take some time to reflect a little bit on the objectives, how to develop a strategy for educational entrepreneurship, and how to develop an operating model. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how those two things, a strategy and an operating model, are not necessarily the same thing. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because one of the things, the thing I'm asking you to do really is to create a draft strategic plan for your educational innovation or entrepreneurial idea. And we're calling it a strategic plan, but we're using a business model outline in order to develop that plan. So that's a bit of a conundrum because a strategy and a model aren't necessarily the same things. So I wanted to highlight one thing that you read today in particular, just as a way to bring you back to all of the ideas from today. And it is this right here, Magreta, Why Business Models Matter, from the Harvard Business Review back in 2006. And I have, let's see if I can get that up. There we go. I have this PDF that I've linked for you already here, and I want to walk through this, as exciting as this is, and point out a few key things. One is, you will note right off the bat that this is an article that is written for business people. It is not written for social entrepreneurs or for educators or anyone that quite frankly would describe us and what we're trying to do in this class. But it does talk about business models and why business models matter, obviously. And it talks about the distinction between a business model and a strategy. So as you're developing your model for your innovation or your entrepreneurial idea, you're also developing a strategy. In other words, we're blending the two in our work. And I think that this article is important to understanding that. So I've highlighted a couple of points in the article. I want to take a brief look at each of those, give you my perspective on them, just as a way for you to bring everything from day 4 together. So a couple things that he says make a good business model. One is telling a good story. And he says right here, robust, let me scroll down a little bit more so hopefully you can see better. A robust business model with all the elements of a good story is what makes a business model. It's got precisely delineated characters, plausible motivations, and a plot that turns on an insight about value. So when we talk about these different characteristics of telling a story through your model, this can help you as you think about how you're developing your strategic plan and the parts that you're writing for it. So when he says precisely delineated characters, I take this to mean that he's talking about identifying very clearly who the target population is and who are the people who are providing the service or the innovation. In other words, you're identifying who the stakeholders are, and you're precisely or clearly delineating, clearly explaining how those different stakeholders are involved in your innovation. That's important because that then helps you understand what the motivations are for those stakeholders to participate, either as service providers or as the recipients or participants in a particular program or whatever their role is. But if we know how the stakeholders are involved, we know what roles they play, then we have an understanding of what the motivations are. Okay. And then he says a plot that turns on an insight about value. Regardless of whether we're talking about business or education, we're all trying to create some sort of value, or we're trying to add value in a way that hasn't been done before. And so having some sort of insight about how to add to that value or create new value out of something, in our case, hopefully socially and educationally related, that's going to be the key to your strategic plan for your innovation. Right? You need to have an insight about value. So if we're talking about creating a new program that is somehow supposed to enhance the civic responsibility of youth, I'm just making that up, then there needs to be some sort of insight about how to create value around the civic responsibility of youth in your particular context, or in your particular using the infrastructure that you have available to you, or in a particular culture that you're working in. It would kind of depend on that, right? So some sort of insight about how you create value for that particular outcome or product or whatever it is. And he points out that creating a business model is a lot like writing a new story, and it has two parts. Part one includes all the activities associated, in this case, in the business case, with making something. And so he uses business language, designing it, purchasing raw materials, manufacturing, and so on. For us, part one then of our model would include all the activities associated with creating the conditions for it. So in our case, that's going to involve infrastructure and capacity. Infrastructure, remember, is the resource or the facility or the personnel. It's what creates the structure upon which you can build your innovation. And remember, or maybe don't remember, maybe I haven't said this yet, but one of the key things to know about infrastructure is when you're creating something innovative, when you're implementing a new program or plan, using existing infrastructure as much as possible is the best way to go, because it is the most sustainable model. It means that there are fewer new or additional resources that are needed. It means that the financial responsibilities and the financial needs of your innovation will be manageable. It means that there might already be some other funding or resource system in place for updating or renewing or fixing things that break, right? So you want to include that part, infrastructure, in part one of your story. Also in part one of your story is capacity. And capacity, if I haven't told you before, is knowledge and skills. So do those stakeholders we were just talking about have all of the knowledge and all of the skills that they will need in order to participate in, implement, assess, whatever they need to do as part of your innovation? And is there a way to create that capacity, to give or to provide training that will bring knowledge and skills for those who don't already have it? All right, that's part one. Part two includes all the activities associated, in this case, remember, he's using a business perspective. He says associated with selling something. That's finding and reaching customers, transacting a sale, distributing the product, or delivering the service. For us, it is going to be, it isn't selling, but it's more like the dissemination or the enactment, or to use the word here, delivery. Right? So finding and reaching customers for us in our social and educational world is finding and reaching the target population, the people who need this innovation. Who are they? They have to be identified. So when you're identifying those stakeholders, you're identifying them not only in terms of who they are, but where they are and how to access them, and how to involve them even in the process of developing the innovation. He says transacting a sale and distributing the product or delivering the service. I'm going to concentrate more, and I think you should as well, on the delivery aspect. How is the model, how is the innovation actually implemented? What do you need to do? And by you, I mean your organization or your group, or if it's just you individually, whatever person it is or group it is, what do you need to do in order to make your innovation come to life? Right? So thinking about the startup phase, thinking about the initial rollout, thinking about checking on what's working and what isn't working, and then making changes to adjust for that. Thinking about long-term sustainability and evaluating the model or evaluating the innovation in a strategic and a systematic way. That's all part of the rollout and the delivery, and then the accountability process that comes back to that. And so you're writing this story that includes infrastructure, it includes capacity, it includes dissemination, and it includes sustainability, right? Those are the dissemination and sustainability are the second two things that are part of this part two. So you see what we're doing here? We're taking this businessy approach and we're adjusting it so that it now has more of a social and educational entrepreneurship approach. Kind of cool, huh? All right. The second part, he says, to a business model, the first part is telling a story. The second part is tying the narrative to numbers. And he specifically talks about how when people started using spreadsheets, they could be much more analytic in how they were planning, because every line item or every major thing that was part of the innovation could be accounted for, and each of its components could be analyzed and tested. And I think that's true for us as well. We want to have some sort of empirical verification or empirical confirmation that this innovation is plausible, could work if it was implemented. Now, this is going to be many steps back from what a business model would look like. We're not in any way trying to show profit. We might be trying to show, if we're thinking finances, we might be trying to show that we can maintain what we're trying to do, that we have enough revenue or enough of a capital base that we can continue to implement the innovation. But it's not going to be the same as you would if you were a business. Some important things, however, about the tying the narrative to numbers. So once an enterprise starts operating, the underlying assumption of its model about both the motivations and economics are subjected to continuous testing, in this case in the marketplace, in our case in the social and educational context. And success, which is the implementation of the program and then achieving whatever targets or goals you have for that, often hinges on management's ability to tweak or even overhaul the model on the fly. So having a plan for how you will evaluate and continuously monitor the innovation that you would like to implement is incredibly important. This is part of tying the narrative to numbers. You want to have some way that you can actually think about the outcomes that you're looking for, that you're desiring for your innovation, and a way to monitor that as you continue to move forward, so that it isn't something that just happens at one point in time at the end of the innovation, but that it happens at regular intervals throughout. Perhaps there's a milestone moment where there's a big evaluation that takes place, but there should be testing throughout or accountability throughout, and tying the narrative to numbers is a way to do that. So business modeling is the managerial equivalent of the scientific method. You start with a hypothesis, which you then test in action and revise when necessary. That's exactly what we just talked about. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pause, because I've actually talked for going on 14 minutes now. I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to come back with a second screencast to sort of tie up the loose ends when we're thinking about how strategies and models converge for our social and educational entrepreneurial ideas.